The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military checkpoint as Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian clothes and approached the barrier. Dust swirled around her boots with each step, and the familiar weight of her hidden dog tags felt heavier than usual against her chest. She had been away from active duty for 6 months now, recovering from injuries that had changed everything about her life, and today marked her first attempt to return to the base where she had once commanded respect. The young soldier at the checkpoint couldn't have been more than 22 years old. His uniform was crisp, his stance rigid, and his eyes held that particular mixture of nervousness and authority that came with being new to the job. Private Johnson, according to his name tag, barely glanced at Sarah as she approached, his attention focused on the digital tablet in his hands. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification and authorization to enter this facility," Private Johnson said without looking up, his voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone who had repeated these words countless times throughout his shift. Sarah reached in her jacket pocket, her fingers automatically moving toward where her military ID should have been. The familiar motion sent a sharp reminder through her body that things were different now. Instead, she pulled out her civilian driver's license and a temporary visitor's pass that had been issued to her by the Veterans Affairs Office. The pass was supposed to grant her access to the medical facilities on base, but she knew it looked different from the usual military authorizations the guards were used to seeing. "Here you go," she said quietly, handing over the documents. Her voice carried a subtle authority that years of military service had ingrained in her, but dressed in civilian clothes with her hair down instead of in regulation style, she looked like any other visitor seeking access to the base. Private Johnson took the documents and studied them with the careful attention of someone who took his duty seriously. His brow furrowed as he looked at the temporary pass, clearly unfamiliar with this particular type of authorization. Sarah watched as he turned the pass over in his hands, examining the official seals and signatures that validated her right to be there. "Ma'am, I'm not familiar with this type of pass," he said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "This doesn't look like standard military authorization. I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify this with my supervisor." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, though she kept her expression neutral. 6 months ago, she would have walked through this same checkpoint without question. Soldiers would have snapped to attention, offering sharp salutes and respectful greetings. Now, she was being treated like a potential security risk, questioned by someone who had probably joined the military while she was already leading missions overseas. "Of course," she replied, stepping to the side of the checkpoint as instructed. Her hands remained steady, but inside, a familiar ache began to spread through her chest. It wasn't anger at the young soldier for doing his job properly. It was the painful reminder of how much her life had changed, how the identity she had built over 15 years of military service seemed to have vanished along with her ability to serve in the same capacity. Sarah watched as Private Johnson spoke into his radio, his voice too low for her to hear the conversation. Other military personnel and authorized civilians moved through the checkpoint around her, flashing their IDs and passing through without incident. Each person who walked by served as another reminder of the normalcy she had lost, the automatic respect and recognition that had once been as natural as breathing. The desert heat was becoming oppressive, and Sarah found herself thinking back to the last time she had been on this base. It was the day before her final mission, the one that had ended with an improvised explosive device and a long stay in a military hospital. She remembered walking through these same gates in her combat uniform, her mind focused on the briefing she was about to give to her unit. Back then, she had been Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, a respected officer with a spotless record and the trust of everyone under her command. Private Johnson finished his radio conversation and walked back toward her, his expression apologetic but firm. Behind him, Sarah could see his supervisor approaching, a sergeant whose own bearing suggested he had been in the military for several years, but still looked young enough to be one of the soldiers she had once commanded. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Williams," the supervisor said as he approached. "Private Johnson tells me there's some question about your authorization. May I see your documents again?" Sarah handed over her identification and temporary pass once more, watching as Sergeant Williams examined them with the same careful scrutiny as a subordinate. She could see the confusion in his eyes as he looked at the unfamiliar formatting of the Veterans Affairs authorization. It was clear that neither soldier had encountered this particular type of documentation before, and their training hadn't prepared them for this specific situation. "Ma'am, I understand you're trying to access the medical facilities, Sergeant Williams said, his tone respectful but cautious. However, we're not familiar with this authorization format, and our protocol requires us to verify any unusual documentation through the appropriate channels. This could take some time. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. She was being denied access to a base where she had once held significant authority, questioned by soldiers who were following the very protocols she had helped establish during her years of service. The security measures that were now working against her were designed to protect the installation she had once called home. I understand your position, Sarah said, her voice calm despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. How long do you estimate the verification process will take? It could be anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, depending on how quickly we can reach the appropriate personnel, Sergeant Williams replied. You're welcome to wait in the visitor area, or you could return at a later time once we've had a chance to verify your authorization. Sarah considered her options. She had driven 3 hours to reach the base, taking time off from her new civilian job for this appointment with the base medical staff. The appointment was part of her ongoing treatment plan, and rescheduling would mean waiting another month for the next available slot. But standing here in the desert heat, being scrutinized by soldiers who didn't recognize her authority, felt like a form of torture she wasn't sure she was ready to endure. The sound of vehicles approaching the checkpoint drew everyone's attention. A convoy of military trucks was returning from what appeared to be a training exercise, their occupants tired but alert. As the vehicles slowed for the checkpoint inspection, Sarah caught sight of several soldiers she recognized from her previous assignments. The familiar faces sent a wave of complex emotions through her, mixing hope with anxiety about whether they would recognize her in her current state. Private Johnson moved to process the returning convoy, his attention shifting away from Sarah's situation for the moment. Sergeant Williams remained with her, but she could see him glancing toward the convoy, clearly torn between his current duty and the need to assist with the larger group of returning military personnel. Sergeant Williams, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a note of understanding. Why don't you help with the convoy? I'll wait in the visitor area while you work on verifying my authorization. The sergeant looked relieved at her suggestion, clearly appreciating her recognition of the practical demands of his position. Thank you for your understanding, ma'am. I'll have someone escort you to the visitor area, and we'll work on getting this resolved as quickly as possible. As Sarah was escorted to a small building that served as the visitor waiting area, she couldn't help but reflect on how different this experience was from her expectations. She had imagined that returning to the base would be difficult emotionally, but she hadn't anticipated the practical barriers that would remind her of her changed status. The waiting area was a stark, functional space with plastic chairs and outdated magazines, designed for people who were temporary visitors rather than those who belonged to the military community. Sitting in the uncomfortable chair, Sarah pulled out her phone and considered calling the medical office to explain the delay. But something made her hesitate. Part of her wanted to see how this situation would resolve itself, to understand whether the system she had once been part of would ultimately recognize her right to be there. It felt like a test of whether her years of service still meant something beyond the memories she carried. Through the window of the visitor area, she could see the checkpoint continuing its normal operations. Private Johnson and Sergeant Williams worked efficiently to process the returning convoy, their movements precise and professional. Watching them reminded Sarah of her own early days in the military, when following protocol and proving herself to superior officers had been the primary focus of her daily existence. The phone rang in the small visitor building, and Sarah watched as a clerk answered it. She couldn't hear the conversation, but the clerk's glances in her direction suggested that the call was related to her authorization situation. After a few minutes, the clerk hung up and approached her with an apologetic expression. "Ma'am, they're still working on verifying your documentation," the clerk said. "It seems your authorization is from a newer system that's not fully integrated with our standard verification database. They're trying to reach someone from the Veterans Affairs Office who can confirm the validity of your pass." Sarah nodded, accepting this explanation while internally marveling at the complexity of military bureaucracy. Even with all her years of experience navigating military systems, she was now subject to the same confusion and delays that affected any civilian trying to access military facilities. The realization that her insider knowledge was no longer sufficient to smooth her path felt like another small loss in a series of adjustments she was still learning to make. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Sarah found herself studying the other people in the waiting area. There was an elderly woman who appeared to be waiting to visit someone on base, a young man in a suit who looked like a contractor or civilian employee, and a mother with two small children who seemed to be meeting with family. Each person represented a different type of relationship with the military community, and Sarah realized she was now trying to figure out where she fit in the spectrum of connection and belonging. The afternoon heat continued to build outside, and Sarah could see the checkpoint guards rotating shifts. Private Johnson was replaced by another young soldier, and Sergeant Williams continued to oversee operations while periodically checking on the status of her authorization verification. The routine nature of the checkpoint operations continued around her situation, a reminder that the military functioned according to its own rhythms and priorities, regardless of individual circumstances. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her civilian employer, asking about her expected return time from the medical appointment. Sarah stared at the message for a moment, considering how to respond when she wasn't even sure she would make it to the appointment at all. The collision between her military past and civilian present felt particularly acute in this moment, as she struggled to explain a delay that arose from her complex relationship with an institution that had once defined her entire identity. Finally, deciding to respond honestly about the delay, Sarah typed a brief message explaining that there had been complications with her base access authorization. As she sent the text, she realized that this experience was teaching her something important about the transition she was still navigating. The assumption that her military background would always be an asset, always be recognized and respected, was proving to be more complicated than she had anticipated. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention back to the immediate situation. Sergeant Williams was walking toward the visitor building with a folder in his hands, and an expression that suggested some kind of resolution had been reached. Sarah stood up as he entered, hoping that whatever news he brought would allow her to finally access the medical facility she needed. "Ma'am, we've made some progress with your authorization," Sergeant Williams said, his tone suggesting that the news was mixed. "We were able to reach someone from the Veterans Affairs office who confirmed that your pass is legitimate. However, there's still some question about the specific areas of the base you're authorized to access." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Progress was good, but the continued complications reminded her that this process was far from over. The complexity of her situation seemed to be beyond what the standard checkpoint procedures were designed to handle, and she could see that Sergeant Williams was doing his best to work within a system that hadn't anticipated her particular circumstances. "What kind of additional verification do you need?" she asked, willing to cooperate with whatever process would finally get her to her medical appointment. "Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated," Sergeant Williams replied, his expression showing that he was as frustrated with the bureaucratic maze as she was. "Your Veterans Affairs pass authorizes you to access medical facilities, but the Base Security Office wants to verify your identity against their personnel records to make sure there are no conflicts or security concerns." The mention of personnel records sent a chill through Sarah. She knew that her military records would contain information about her service, her rank, and the circumstances of her medical retirement. The thought of those records being reviewed by people who didn't know her personally, who might only see the clinical details of her injuries and discharge, felt invasive